Hi everyone. Let's continue this series on the martial attack. In this video, we're going to look at some alternatives that Black can choose instead of the mainline way of playing it. In particular, we're going to look at a famous game featuring the very first martial attack. It's the original game. And the game was played between Jose Raul Capablanca, who had the white pieces, and Frank Marshall, the person whom the opening is named after. So this game was played in 1918 in a tournament in New York. It was round one. And let's review the moves of the martial attack. So it's a variation of the Ruy Lopez. And it occurs in the closed variations, which is signified by this move bishop e7. And here Black castles, indicating the desire to play d5. c3 allows it, and d5 starts the martial attack. E takes d5 is played, knight takes d5, and now the pawn on e5 is hanging. And so white takes it. Black trades knights and draws that rook to the center of the board. And so we've seen these moves in our earlier videos of the series, and you know that the main line is this move c6 to defend that loose knight. But we're going to look at some alternatives to the main line in this video, including the move that Frank Marshall played. Now, before we look at that game, let's talk about Frank Marshall a little bit. I learned about him by reading his Wikipedia page. So he lived from 1877 to 1944. He was one of the world's strongest players in the early 20th century. In fact, he was the US champion for a long stretch of time, from 1909 to 1936. He didn't have such a great record in matches against strong players, so his reputation as a strong player in history is probably not as good as it should be. I found out that he did win the 1904 Cambridge Springs International Chess Congress. That's the tournament, I mentioned this in another video, that's the tournament that first featured a few games played in the Cambridge Springs defense to the Queen's Gambit. And he won that convincingly over strong opposition. He opened the Marshall Chess Club in New York City in 1915, one of the country's oldest chess clubs, still there today. And he's famous for another game besides this one. Wikipedia mentions the game Levitsky versus Marshall. If you don't know that game, look it up. It features a brilliant queen sacrifice on move 23, queen to g3. Okay, you may know that game. All right, and Frank Marshall's opponent here, Capablanca, was a Cuban chess prodigy, and he became world champion in 1921. He took the title from Emanuel Lasker, and he held the title until he lost it to Alekhine in 1927. And Capablanca was known as a great endgame player. So we're going to have a little treat here and watch this spectacular game. I've noticed a lot of people point out that this is one of the most beautiful, famous games. It's often considered in the top 10 games of all time. And we're going to enjoy it. Before we look at what Frank Marshall's move was in this position, I want to talk about what are Black's options. Well, the knight on d5 is hanging, so he needs to either defend it or move it. And as I said, the main line is defending it with the pawn. And it continues d4. The bishop kicks the rook out of the center, falls back to e1. Queen to h4, bringing the queen to the king side for an attack. And there's an attack on the h2 square. Black defends with g3, and then the queen nestles into that h3 square. So in this main line, Black is putting a lot of pressure on the king side. The bishop and the queen are both well placed. This light squared bishop is poised to take advantage of the light squared weaknesses that were created by that pawn move, g3. And this rook on the A file usually gets over to the E file, and this pair of rooks has an influence. The F pawn gets pushed, sometimes all the way to F4. And we've seen examples of sacrifices taking place on the F4 square, putting a minor piece there sometimes. And so this is a strong attack, and white needs to defend precisely. And in this main line, black's pieces are ideally situated. But what are the other options black has here? Well, another way to defend the knight, and the only other way to defend the knight, is with bishop to b7. Now that's sometimes played, and I found in the databases some top-level games with bishop to b7. The engine doesn't say it's best, though. The engine does prefer the mainline move c6, and there is a drawback to this move. If white plays d4, like in the main line, then black no longer has the move d6, or bishop to d6 rather, because that cuts off the queen's defense to that knight, and black loses material. So instead, black often plays bishop to f6 to kick the rook back. But then black's pieces don't look as strongly poised to attack, to me anyway, as they do in the main line. This queen did not make its way over to the king side. This bishop is blocking the access of that queen to that side of the board. And the bishop here is looking at this pawn chain, and it's pointed at h4, it's not pointed at h2. So these pieces are not as offensive as they are in the main line. However, that bishop on b7 does look pretty good on that long diagonal. Okay, anyway, that's one of the drawbacks, is that bishop doesn't go to d6. However, I did notice in the database that instead of d4, grandmasters have often preferred the move queen to f3, pinning the knight to the b7 bishop. And there were some interesting games played where now the bishop goes to d6, attacking that loose rook, and white takes off the knight on d5, and now instead of recapturing or capturing the rook, black plays c6. So now the bishop on d5 and the rook on e5 are both hanging, and white saves the rook by moving it to e2. Notice e2 rather than e1. There's a point to that. And then black recovers the piece. d4 was played in a few games. Queen to c7, making a battery against that h2 square. g3 to stop that. And then rook a, e8. And black's trying to take over the e file here, and now you can see why that rook is on e2, because it's already defended by the queen, so the rook can maintain its position on that file. So what has black achieved here? Well, I'm not sure this is as good as the main line. The engine says this is plus 0.5, so it's a slight advantage to white. These pieces are just not as aggressive as they are in the main line. This bishop looks pretty bad now on b7 with that central pawn stuck there. I suppose it could later transfer over to c8 and take advantage of that diagonal. And another thing I notice in this position is black may have some sort of minority attack here, may be able to push this pawn to b4 and create some kind of pawn weakness on the queen side. If he captures and white recaptures with a pawn, then white will have a backward c-pawn. Or if white recaptures with a piece, then he'll have an isolated d-pawn. So maybe there's some play in this position, and I haven't looked at any of the Grandmaster games yet, so you might want to give this bishop to b7 line a closer look. Okay, but going back to our key position here, with that knight under attack, the only other option is to move it somewhere. And there were not very many games where black moved it to f4, which looks pretty aggressive. And I think that's because d4 immediately gains a tempo on the knight. The bishop is attacking it. Well, the knight can fall back to g6 and attack the rook. The rook can retreat. And then maybe bishop b7, taking control of that long diagonal. This might be a way to play, but the engine doesn't really like it. It's plus 1.1, and I guess these pieces just are not very aggressive, and white can probably defend much easier here than in the main line. So I didn't see really any games with knight f4. However, there are some games with the move knight to f6, and that's the move in our game between Capablanca and Marshall. So let's continue and follow that game and see what happens after knight to f6. I think the point is to transfer that knight to g4, where it can become a strong attacking unit. All right, so the rook on e5 is not tenable. You can't hold that rook there. It's going to be kicked either with the bishop or the knight. So Capablanca preferred to retreat it now. And then bishop to d6 comes. Then h3. And h3 looks like it's designed to keep the black knight off of g4. Well, surprise. Marshall plays knight g4 anyway, sacrificing the knight. Okay, well, the move h3 at least removes the pawn from being captured, so there's no loose pawn here in h2 right now. But the question is, can white take the knight? Well, Capablanca didn't seem to think so. He played queen to f3, and he was praised by writers that have commented on this game for defending so well against the strong preparation Marshall had in this opening. And queen to f3 is the top engine choice. But what happens if white takes the knight? Well, then queen to h4 is a strong attacking move with the idea of queen to h2 check and eventually flushing that king out to the e2 square. And the engine seems to think the best defense is rook to e4, lifting the rook forward, so the king, when it comes out to e2, will be behind the protection of the rook and won't have to face a check on the e-file. And then the best play line the engine thinks is queen to h2 check, and then flushing that king out to e2, and then taking the pawn on g2. And white's attack is pretty... or black's attack rather is pretty strong here with threats of taking this pawn. It's under attack twice. This pawn is pinned. The king looks rather precarious on the e2 square. So black is in control of that position according to the engine. So it was correct not to take that knight and to play queen to f3. Okay, now notice that queen on f3 is defending the f2 square, and it's also hitting the rook on a8. So what does black do about his rook? Well, he doesn't want to take time to just move it. He's on the attack here. Every tempo counts. He plays queen to h4. Okay, brilliant move, and that indirectly defends the rook. Now white cannot take it because there's a mate in 2. Check and mate. Okay, so that queen is putting pressure on the f2 square. So the rook is immune, and instead white plays a d4. Good move, excellent move, approved by the engine again, opening the diagonal for the dark squared bishop. These pieces need to get developed. Okay, now another surprising move. The knight on g4 was taboo. Well, Marshall plays it to f2 and says go ahead and take it on another square. Okay, and again, Capablanca declines to take it and plays rook to e2. That is also approved by the engine, although if he had taken it, queen takes f2, the engine says that's about equal to Capablanca's move. He could have taken the knight, but it's no better than declining it, apparently. What would black have done here if he had taken that knight? Well, it's tempting to play bishop to g3 maybe, skewering the rook, but that doesn't work. That fails to a standard mate in 2 tactic. Do you see white's checkmate in this position? This is a standard configuration here where the queen and the bishop are both pointed at that F7 square, and black's back rank is weak right now because that bishop is sitting there blocking that rook out. So white's going to take on F7, but do you know which piece he's going to take with? Yeah, that's right. He's going to take with the queen, forcing the rook to take, because if king to H8, then queen takes the rook on F8 is a checkmate. So the rook has to take, and the point of taking with the queen is the bishop now maintains a pin on the rook. The rook can't move, and so white gets this back rank checkmate. So bishop to G3 would not have been the move if white had taken that knight. So what had Marshall planned? Well, he planned this very clever, instead of bishop to G3, bishop to H2 check. Okay, now the king cannot go to H1 because the queen would get taken on F2. So the king has to go to F1. So now the bishop would go to G3. What's the difference between the king being here versus here? Well, now this move doesn't work because when black is forced to capture with the rook, it's with check. And so white doesn't have that mate, and black is actually winning here. So that's very clever to force that king over to that square where it's going to be checked. So instead, though, white could have moved the queen over, saved itself to D2, and then the engine says the attack would have continued with bishop takes H3, and white maintains an advantage in this position, plus 1.2. So that was a way for white to play, although it looks really scary to me. Just because the engine says it's plus 1.2 doesn't mean it's easy to defend. Okay, so going back to the game, Capablanca doesn't take the knight. Instead, he plays rook E2 and attacks the knight with the rook. Okay, now bishop G4, putting another piece en prise. Amazing. Bishop to G4, and this time Capablanca does take the offered piece. Okay, but then bishop to H2 check forces the king to its only legal square, and then bishop to G3 protects the knight. However, white takes it with the rook, and before taking back, Marshall makes an excellent move, queen to H1 check, skewering that bishop there on C1, which is loose. The king goes up, and then black takes the rook, and now both bishops are hanging. And by the way, right now the material count is white has 2 minor pieces for a rook. That is a material advantage. So all white needs to do is develop his pieces and get his king safe and win the endgame. He's defending very well. The engine says it's plus 1.9 right now. Okay, so what should white do here, though? Should he save this bishop or should he trade bishops? Well, Capablanca correctly saves his bishop by playing it to D2. Engine approved again. He made so many great engine moves. In many cases, they were only moves. Bishop to D2. What would have happened if he had taken the bishop? Well, if he had taken the bishop with, let's say, the king, which is actually much better than taking with the queen, then black would have taken the bishop on C1, and black has a big threat. Queen takes B2 check, and getting the rook on A1 here. And the engine claims there's only one way white can hold the game, and it's all zeros. It's a draw. The engine says this position is a draw, and white would have had to play queen to D1, with the idea that if queen takes B2, then knight to D2 blocks the check, and the queen defends the rook. Okay, but black would have had a perpetual check, apparently, starting with queen to F4 check, king to G1, queen to E3 check, and there are a lot of different ways this could happen, but that king would not be able to escape all the checks without the position deteriorating. So the engine claims it would have been a draw in this position if white had decided to take that bishop. So instead he plays bishop to d2, and now bishop to h4, saving the bishop, and queen to h3, forking the queen and the bishop, asking for a queen trade, which black doesn't want to give because his attack would fizzle out and white's superior material would win the game. So black saves the position, at least temporarily, by giving a check with the rook. King goes to d3 and then giving a check with the queen, avoiding the queen trade. The king nestles into c2, where it's actually quite safe now, and then black saves his bishop by moving it to f2. But now the engine really likes white's position and says white is perfectly safe, plus 3.2 with the big material advantage. Okay, queen to f3 was played, pinning the bishop. Queen to g1, breaking the pin. Bishop d5, maybe releasing this b pawn to come forward. c5, maybe trying to break up some pawns here in front of the white king. Black still needs to get to that white king. But d takes c5, bishop takes c5, was played b4, hitting the bishop. Bishop retreats to d6. And then a4, and all of a sudden we see this rook come to life. It's going to have an open A file. White has no problems at all, plus 4.3. a5 was played, a takes b5, a takes b4, rook to a6, hitting the bishop, b takes c3, hitting white's bishop in turn, but then knight takes c3. And there's no pawn cover for the white king, but all the pieces are doing a good job defending it. Bishop to b4, saving the bishop, but then the passed pawn marches forward, and white's plan is very simple. He wants to push the pawn to b7 and then play the rook to a8, and that rook would be supported by those pieces as well. And there's nothing to stop this plan. Bishop takes c3 was played, bishop takes c3, h6 gaining luft, the pawn marches forward, rook to e3 attacking the queen, maybe looking for some kind of perpetual, taking over here, I don't know. But then the winning move, bishop takes f7 check. Great move, and here black resigned. So let's see, why did he resign? Well, there are three legal moves. If black had played king to h8 to get out of check, then there's this very nice mate, rook takes h6, and that's an immediate mate. The pawn here is pinned by the bishop. Okay, so that doesn't work. What about king to h7? Well, then queen to f5 check, and either the king goes back to h8 and gets mated by the rook again, or the pawn comes forward and he gets mated by the queen. So that's a mate as well. And the only other move is taking the bishop with the rook and abandoning the back rank, but then the pawn queens with check, and we won't look through the mate in 4 here, but white's material makes it very easy to find a mate in the position. So Marshall correctly resigned in this position after bishop takes f7 check. Okay, so brilliant game. I've heard people online tell me that Marshall had this plan, this d5 pawn sacrifice in the Ruy Lopez planned for somewhere around 10 years before he uncorked it on Capablanca. So it must have been just a bitter disappointment to actually lose this game after having that preparation for so long. Wikipedia, however, tells me that Marshall actually played this attack in a few games prior to this over the years, but they never gained any notice. So maybe it still was a hidden piece of preparation as far as Capablanca was concerned. Okay, so we've explored some additional ideas black may have in the main line. You can try Marshall's move, knight to f6 in that main line, because it's fallen out of favor and nobody knows it anymore. You might be able to prepare something and you might be able to do better than Marshall did. Hopefully your opponent will not be as strong as Capablanca. All right, thanks for watching the video. I hope you learned something. I sure did.